Hello, students. I want to continue thinking about the role of peace or shalom in the Bible in this series of Go Deeper conversations. I want to think specifically about what this looks like through the Old Testament. There's obviously a lot of ground to cover in the Old Testament, so we will only get to hit a few high points. But I want to start back in the Garden of Eden, which we left off with last time when we talked about creation and the nature of God. In the story of the Garden of Eden, which is recorded in the first chapters of the Bible, the first few chapters of Genesis, God creates a beautiful world, a world that is suited for humans, that will meet all of their needs. It is a world which reflects his own shalom, or peacefulness. And in this world that God creates, humans are given the conditions that they need to flourish, to be at peace, to be well. But something happens that wrecks this world. And that's what leads to the conflict that we recognize in our world today. We can talk about this problem as sin. That's a word that's used not in Genesis, but it's used later to describe what's going on in the Garden of Eden. And we can think about it in four ways. So God has given human beings everything they need. He's given them all they need to live physically, fruit on the trees, a beautiful land to live in. They don't even need clothes because the climate is just right. So he's met all of their physical needs. He's also met their emotional needs. Genesis 2 says that Adam felt lonely, and God said it's not good for him to be alone. And so he created woman, and we have the first couple and companionship. So Adam's relational needs were met, emotional needs. And then, of course, God was present with those humans in the garden. He walked with them, the text says, which means their spiritual needs were met. So God gives them all these conditions for flourishing. But for some reason, and we can't get into that story very much here, Adam and Eve disregarded these gifts, and they distrusted God. They were tempted, and instead of trusting God's words, they went off on their own. And if you remember the story, they ate the fruit and they were banished from the garden. And we can talk about how the peace was broken in at least four different ways. One, their peace with God was broken. And it was broken because they didn't trust God. They didn't believe what he said, that this would lead to death. And so that damaged their relationship with God. It damaged or broke the relationship they had with each other. When God calls them out in Genesis 3, Adam immediately says, "This woman whom you gave me, she caused me to sin." So they blame each other, and strife is introduced. One of the curses in Genesis 3 is that the man would rule over the woman. So introducing domination and subordination into human relations. Third, we can talk about our relationship to the earth was harmed. The earth or creation is actually closely tied to human well-being, as we'll see more in just a minute. From this point on, Adam would earn his bread by the sweat of his brow. Nature would feel like it was against him as he labored in the soil against thorns and thistles. And so the harmonious relationship with nature was now compromised. And then lastly, something broke within ourselves in this moment. We were no longer at peace with ourselves. And even though the text doesn't talk about this, we could trace the beginning of anxiety. Genesis 3 does say they were ashamed of their actions. It said they were afraid. So there's an inner turmoil that comes. So we see peace being broken in at least four ways. The relationship to God, humans' relationship to each other, humans' relationship to nature, and our relationship to our own self, to our bodies, to our inner self. The rest of the Bible is the story of God seeking to repair this brokenness. Because God doesn't just leave us to our own devices, but he constantly pursues us, in some ways continuing that work of creation, trying to build it back or to restore what's been broken, to restore the peace. In the biblical narrative, we see this first with a man named Abraham in Genesis 12. Abraham, who in some ways is like a new Adam, is the one who responds to God's call. God calls him to leave his family and his house and to follow him. And Abraham responds in trust. Remember, Adam and Eve broke the trust. They did not believe God, even though they had every reason to believe God because of the beauty of the garden. Abraham, on the other hand, didn't have any of those things, and yet he still stepped out in faith and trusted God. And we see in Abraham the beginnings of what God wants us to be. And this is the beginning of the restoration of peace. Abraham is just one man, but God promised that he will be the father of many nations. And his story is humble because he just has one son of promise named Isaac. But as you keep reading the biblical story, Isaac becomes the father of Jacob, and Jacob becomes the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, and that in turn becomes a great people. So as you keep reading through Genesis, those promises made to Abraham are fulfilled in his offspring. And just as Abraham is a model of trust, a model of faith as one person, the people of Israel are called to be the model of faith and trust as a nation or a people. So we have the individual level and we have the social or communal level. We get into the story of Israel in the book of Exodus, which is the second book of the Bible. And Exodus begins with a picture of sin at a whole new level. So Genesis begins with human sin at a personal level. Exodus begins with human sin at the social or structural level. We're not just talking about people doing bad things to each other. Now we're talking about a whole society, the Egyptian society, which is corrupt. We know they're corrupt because the story begins with Pharaoh enslaving the people of Israel. It also begins with the story of Pharaoh threatened by this foreign people, and so he slaughters their children, an act of genocide, killing the innocent. So this is a society that's characterized by exploitation of labor, slavery, and by violence, particularly violence against children. This is what sin looks like when it infiltrates a whole culture, society. And so God calls Israel out of that, not only to lead a different life, but to deliver them from their suffering. The text says that the people cry out to God. They cry for peace, shalom. God hears their cry. He sends Moses, and Moses leads them out of slavery. And this is the story of the Exodus. Now, what's more interesting for our purposes is what happens once they're independent. Once they're on their own, we read in places like Exodus 19 that God has chosen Israel. He hasn't just delivered them from slavery. He's chosen them for a mission, for a purpose. And we might summarize that purpose as they are going to live out the character of God through their society. Abraham is a model of a faithful individual, but Israel is going to model for the whole world what a faithful society looks like. What does God intend for us to be? What does shalom or peace look like in a law system, in a justice system, in a social system? One way to understand what's going on here is that God, who is, remember, a God of peace from eternity, God is a God of peace, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Israel is going to reflect God's own character in their national life. And so they meet God at the mountain, at Mount Sinai, and God gives them the law through Moses. And this law is a great gift. It's a gift because it's a kind of instruction manual. It's literally Torah, which means the way. And it's the way to life, or the way to shalom. Here, as it were, is the key from the Maker himself. This is the key to living well, the key to flourishing. He not only gives them the law, or the way, he also gives them a land, the land of Israel. This is sometimes called the Promised Land. And he invites them to live out their life on this, little bit of territory. And if they live it out well, he promises, not only will they flourish and thrive, but the people around them will see how well they're doing and will want to come and join. They want to join the way of God, which is the way of life. I want to read you a section from the Torah. This is from the book of Leviticus, chapter 26, beginning in verse 3. It's a beautiful image of what peace looked like. in this time. It's God speaking. He says, if you follow my statutes and keep my commandments and observe them faithfully, I will give you your rains in their season, and the land shall yield its produce, and the trees of the field shall yield their fruit. Your threshing shall overtake the vintage, and the vintage shall overtake the sowing. You shall eat your bread to the full, and live securely in your land, and I will grant shalom, peace in the land. And you shall lie down, and no one shall make you afraid. I will remove dangerous animals from the land, and no sword shall go through your land. If we skip down to verse 11, I will place my dwelling in your midst, and I shall not abhor you. I will walk among you, and will be your God, and you shall be my people. Do you hear that restoration of the brokenness of Eden? God is saying, if you walk in the way of creation, the way of life, which I've given you in these laws, then what you're going to experience is material well-being. You're going to have plenty to eat because the rains are going to be consistent. The grape season is going to overtake the wheat season. You'll just have more than you can even harvest. He talks elsewhere about long life, about children surviving into adulthood and old age. So there's the material dimension, right? Then there's also the social dimension. You will have peace in your land. God's going to protect them from those enemies who have the sword. That's the kind of peace that we're used to talking about. But he also talks about a personal peace. He says you won't be afraid anymore. Have you ever been concerned about your job, about the next paycheck, about a bill? That produces anxiety. It's the opposite of peace. God says those things are going to be taken care of. Have you ever been concerned about a relationship gone wrong, maybe even physically threatened? Well, Israel was surrounded by enemies, but God says you don't have to worry about that anymore. Do not be afraid. So outer peace and inner peace, they're both connected to following in God's way of peace, which is codified in the Torah, in the law. So let's talk about the law for just a minute. Remember, I said the law was a kind of instruction manual, a set of instructions for how to create a godly society, a society that reflects the nature of God. Well, there are laws which promote peace at all these levels, because that's what God's concerned with. So let's go back to that personal peace, that inner peace. God, of course, makes all these promises, which is the basis for peace. But God also tells the people, the fourth commandment, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. This becomes a really important part of Jewish faith, which is the Sabbath day. It's the seventh day of the week, Saturday. And the law says that you're not to work on Saturday. Saturday is to be a holy day where you rest. Interestingly, it's not only the people that rest, but the slaves also rest. No one works. Even the animals get a day off on the Sabbath. And what's the purpose of the Sabbath? Well, it's to pause and to remember that all good things come from God. My work is important, but my work is not absolute. God will take care of everything because he's the creator and he loves this world and it's going to be okay. It's also a time to simply rest because that's what God does on the seventh day in Genesis 1. He rests after his labors. And we're humans. We need rest. And there's also a call to delight in God's world. Sabbath day was characterized by families being together, by food, eating together. Sometimes music was involved, or storytelling. It's a time to delight in the goodness of the world which God created and said, it is very good. And it's by resting, it's by delighting, it's by giving thanks that we actually become like God and that we enjoy the fullness of life, which is peace. So that's one example of a law which cultivates peace within, inner peace. There are lots and lots of laws about social peace, about our relations to each other. Many of them just very ordinary kinds of laws about interacting with each other. But fundamental to the Israelite worldview was that all people are created in the image of God. In other societies in that time, there were two versions of the laws. There was the version for our people, and then there was the version for the foreigners and the strangers. There's the version for citizens, and there's the version for non-citizens. But Israel was committed to treating all people as equal in the sight of God, all people with dignity and respect. This included the strangers or the foreigners, but it also included groups like the slaves, the poor, the widows, and the orphans. Many of Israel's laws are concerned with the most vulnerable among them. And the idea is that I can't have peace, I can't enjoy peace until in some sense everyone has the conditions necessary for peace. If there's some people who are out on the streets, that's going to affect my peace too. But it's also because God cares about those people. Over and over again in the Old Testament, we read this line: God is a God of the fatherless. He's called the Father of the fatherless in Psalm 68. He's the God of the widow. He's the God of the poor. And he's the God of the immigrant or the foreigner. So just like God has a special interest in these vulnerable groups, the people of Israel construct their society to make sure those people's welfare is taken care of. And in that way, they're going to reflect the nature of God. And also, the people around them, these other nations who don't know the God of Israel, are going to see, wow, this group of people has a different kind of peace, a unique peace, where they really care for each other. And especially they care for the weak. I'd like to be a part of that. That sounds like a good way of life. And just one example of this is the gleaning laws in the Old Testament. So if you're not familiar with the gleaning laws, if you're a farmer and you had a field of wheat, the gleaning law says, when you're harvesting your wheat, leave a little bit on the edges. Don't be maximally efficient. Don't maximize your profits. But leave some on the edges so that the poor can come and eat. Even though they didn't grow it, even though it's not their property, it was a way of taking care of the poor. And it was also a way of curbing excessive buildup of wealth among the landowners. So that's one very practical law that Israel had, which not only allowed the poor to eat, but also preserved their dignity, because they were still working for their food. They still harvested the wheat themselves and then used it to feed their families. So we see specific concrete laws like that, which Israel was able to care for their neighbors, to love their neighbors, and experience that peace proactively in their relationships with one another. And of course, whenever Israel went, they built the tabernacle and then later the temple at the very center of their camp as a symbol that God is at the center of their lives. That true peace comes by being oriented towards God, by sharing the concerns of God. God cares for the poor, we should care for the poor. God delights in creation, we should delight in creation. And as we become more and more like God, we will enjoy more and more of His own joy, of His own peace. That's the promise that God makes to Israel. Well, we've had to skip over many things, but hopefully that gives you some taste of this concept of peace or shalom in the Old Testament, especially in the laws. We'll start to look at the life of Jesus next time we're together and think about what peace looks like in the ministry of Jesus. Thanks.